think this will help. Thanks for the lovely introduction, both of myself and of Stuart Hall. I think what makes the ASSR a great place to do research for myself, but potentially Stuart Hall might have felt at home here too, is its, I think, facilitation of interdisciplinary conversations and transgressions of disciplinary boundaries, which not every university is equally supportive of. I'll make no mention of any specific universities. Okay. I was actually asked initially, would you, as a representative of the geography department, I think, be willing to speak on David Harvey? Well, David Harvey is obviously, a very influential and important thinker and a geographer. But first of all, I felt non-equipped to really speak for his work. But secondly, while it definitely has some relevance to work I'm doing on urban inequalities, I felt Stuart Hall was much more central for me in trying to think through how I position myself within the social science in relation to matters of culture, of power, and so on. So precisely for the reasons I think that Brian introduced. He's very close to my own work, but I think also to a range of interests that span student and faculty life within the ASSR. Okay. After a brief introduction, I'm going to follow a more or less standard format by discussing his biography, which does, as we've seen with other great thinkers, relate quite closely to his research themes and also his approaches. And he's a very, very prolific author and thinker. So it's quite difficult to say, okay, what shall I focus on without being extremely superficial? So I decided to focus just on a few themes. But first of all, why do I feel Stuart Hall is important? Why do I feel he's a great thinker? So I have some issues with the idea of great thinkers. Right? I guess in general, the idea of a series, while I find it great to be able to sit back and to listen and to sort of also consume and to be a student for a minute and to learn in a sort of neat format about people whose work I only superficially know, it also has this element of canonization to say, like, okay, these are the people you must know, and these are the people who matter. And those types of canons always have some type of what you could call violence, epistemic violence, to say, this is what counts, this is what doesn't. Of course, we do that all the time, just in who we quote, who we cite, and so on. But there is some tension there, especially for people who critique structures of authority, as Stuart Hall himself did. So there's a bit of awkwardness there, also because he was someone who was very committed to seeing intellectual production as something collaborative, something you do together, something that's also about critiquing the institutions you're in and not necessarily about individual excellence. So those are sort of the kanttekeningen, the footnotes I should add there. Okay, the main reason he's seen as a great thinker, as a very influential scholar, is that he's associated with the establishment of the field of cultural studies in the UK, but I'd say more broadly internationally. And specifically through as one of the co-founders, part of the establishing of the Birmingham Center for Contemporary Cultural Studies, University of Birmingham. But more broadly, what he did throughout his career was to link very concretely the study of culture and the study of politics, to say you can't actually see these two separately. So you cannot see culture as something apolitical. Now, to many of you, or to me at this point in my research trajectory, this seems completely self-evident. But actually, also in my own background as an anthropologist, it wasn't necessarily seen that way. I think in many more humanities-oriented disciplines, it definitely wasn't always the case, and it still often isn't the case that we see culture and cultural production and aesthetic formations as necessarily political or as a field of struggle. And so that is one move he made to say, okay, let's look at literature, but let's also look at popular culture, popular arts, other types of cultural production that we don't always or haven't always seen as the same as literature. so on. Let's understand those as a site of political struggle. But at the same time, so I'm glad to hear for this reason that Brian has also read Stuart Hall, or that political scientists are also engaging with it, is that we cannot understand politics, we cannot understand political struggle without attending to the cultural. We can't see politics as something that's only about material relations, economic conditions, who's in parliament. It's not just about party politics, electoral representation. It's really about struggles over meaning. Power politics is being able to control what people know to be true, what they're able to see, speak, hear, but also envision and imagine. That's where true power lies. And it's never separate from those material, political, economic relations, but it's absolutely core to understanding how power works. So you cannot understand politics, you can't understand the political power struggles without understanding structures, processes of meaning-making. So these two go hand in hand. So I don't know if this now is the case in political science, that this is an understanding of politics that's mainstream, that it is also cultural. Might depend on which class you're in, and vice versa. I wouldn't say that every let's say humanities discipline or every anthropology program has this hardcore sort of focus on politics and culture, though it may have become a little more mainstream. But this is really his core contribution, I would say, to bring those fields incontrovertibly together. An additional thing he did in the context of the UK, but with a much broader impact, is to speak to, but also to live, to show in his own practice a new type of intellectual possibility, a way of being an intellectual. So he both wrote on and spoke on, but also, as I said, practiced in his own life a different type of purpose for theory, but also for being an intellectual. So I want to speak a little bit about that as well. I don't know if it's possible in the contemporary university system that we have now, but I think the way he lived his academic life, or his intellectual life, you would say, is a model that's I don't know, could be emulated to some extent. Okay. In addition to that, I wanted to say, beyond the political focus on culture, which is going to be my main focus here, another main contribution, again, not necessarily on his own, but in relation to various other authors, was to emphasize that culture is always relational, so to bring a relational approach to culture in multiple ways. So you can't see culture as separate from politics. Culture is always relational in terms to, or should also always be understood in relation to the material basis, political and economic relations, but it can also not be seen in isolation from other cultures. So there's never any type of purity, any type of authenticity. The only type of cultures we have are hybrid and interrelational. So we only understand what we are in relation to other cultures. And while this has also become more or less mainstream, you could still say in popular understandings, that's not how people see culture. They still see it as sort of bounded, reified, non-hybrid. So in short, what I'm going to talk about is culture as a site of struggle, of ongoing struggle, but also as a process over which he says we must struggle. And to give, so this is in language, in images, in text, but also more broadly in systems of, or what he would call regimes of representation. That's where struggles over precisely those same material relations are. I'm giving a PhD workshop 2 weeks from now, I think, so I'm assuming a number of those people are here. But also, we've been having in our own department, and I know in the ASR, been having broader discussions over the labor position of PhDs. Just to give one small example, when you think about what is the importance of text, of image, of representation, one thing we've been discussing, or the PhDs have been discussing, is what do you call a PhD? When you call them a PhD student, you're also naturalizing their position as a non-laborer, non-employee. Because if you call them a PhD candidate, there's more space within which to maintain the employee position, which has been fought for in previous years or previous decades, which has been an established labor position for PhDs since the 1990s. Whereas if you call a PhD student, you're eroding through language the labor position of that same worker. just an example. I still slip up and say PhD student a lot, but this is where the politics of language and representation show up in a small way in our everyday environment. Okay. Moving on to biography. Another reason I chose Stuart Hall, or I proposed Stuart Hall and was accepted, was indeed, as Brian suggested, his link to Jamaica, where most of my own research has also been focused on. So he was born there in 1932, so 30 years before Jamaica's independence from the UK. And he actually only lived there until he was 18. He moved to the UK, to Oxford, in 1951 on a Rhodes Scholarship. That's Cecil Rhodes, after whom colonial Rhodesia was named. And he said he left Jamaica in part to escape his family. Though he later also said, he said, I would say this to joke, I left to escape my family, but it was true. But at the same time, you can't escape. And at a later point, they weren't there, or they passed away, but they were still in his head, and it's much harder to escape people when they're in your head. Let me just show some pictures. One of the reasons he was struggling with this, and that there was also an irony, they also said that he had to accept a scholarship named after or bequeathed by someone who was so implicated in a racist colonial project, was that his own upbringing was shaped entirely by the class and color politics, skin color politics of a pre-independence Jamaica. So his own positioning was middle class. His background was middle class from both parents, but they were differently positioned. So his father was from let's say lower middle class and somewhat darker skinned family from just outside of Kingston, and his father was one of the first non-white sort of senior workers for the United Fruit Company, one of the famous banana companies. Whereas his mother was from a more established middle-class family, was also lighter-skinned. And in the context of the Jamaica of the time, but it continues until today, sort of these gradations of color, which are very different from, say, U.S. bipolar system, if you're either white or you're black, but where your exact shade of brown was considered extremely crucial in sort of your social status and also your level of civilization. And his mother in particular, but also his father, was very preoccupied with being as British or as close to white as possible. And he said multiple times in interviews and his own writing that being one of the darkest members of his family was sort of a source of contention, or it really shaped himself in how he related to both Jamaica, but later also to coming to Britain. So he was really shaped by this colonial, Eurocentric, middle-class background. And it also, he went to one of Jamaica's elite schools, Jamaica College, where also a lot of then and future politicians went. And he went to Oxford, so he lived up to his mother's dreams in that regard. So he called himself a familiar stranger. Once he went to England, he was a stranger, but at the same time it was very familiar. So he always had this sort of insider-outsider relationship to the UK, which I think also informed very much his understandings of culture in general. So here's a specific quote from an interview. When he writes about culture, when he thinks about culture and his work has been mainly on the UK, though it's been to some extent also on black diasporic culture more broadly. But he says that basically all of his writing has been informed through his formative years in the Caribbean. And that also made it difficult for him at any point to see culture as this pure, unmediated thing. So culture is always a translation. There's no essential, pure culture, no authentic, sort of original culture anywhere. And that's that understanding is shaped by growing up in Jamaica, where everything is a mix. And then when you look at Jamaicans coming to the UK, you see another translation, another mix again. So in addition to showing you the processes of translation, of mixture, of articulation, it also shows the dynamism of culture, that culture is never something reified, never something that stands still. So this, I think, we can see very much in relation to his own background, in his own words as well. But I think this is also interesting in relation to debates that we see now in urban studies, but also more broadly on geographies of theory. This is sometimes called Ananya Roy, Jennifer Robinson. I would say, okay, how are ideas or how are theories based in experiences, say empirical research, in one context, and how do they then travel? And in the context of urban studies, this is usually applied to say, okay, theories are based on cities such as New York or London, and then they become universalized. So we start seeing gentrification everywhere, even though it's a term that's specifically originated in European and American cities. So shouldn't we critique this type of universalizing of cities of the global north? But I think what Stuart Hall does in a way is perhaps inadvertently the opposite. So he takes a Jamaican experience, which is reflected on extensively, but then uses it to understand what's going on in the UK. So it's a different type of traveling concepts. Flipping back. Okay, so he moved to Oxford. He studied English literature there. He started a PhD on American novelist Henry James, but actually stopped in 1956, 1957 and moved to London to engage in more political editorial work. So I find this interesting. This is probably one of the few people in our Great Thinkers seminar series who doesn't have a PhD, though he was a professor of sociology and a president of the British Sociological Association. So certainly in that time, you didn't necessarily need a PhD to sort of reach the peak of a sociological career. But what I find interesting also is his beginnings were really very firmly in literature, so in English literature and also sort of traditional ways of looking at literature. But he became increasingly involved in political organizing, became the editor, sort of I guess sort of micropolitics between different university-based journals, different journals in the sort of left-wing circles. But he became editor of the New Left Review. And this was also in the context of what he called his sort of formative events of 1956. I had to read these things to know what is the year 1956. But does the year 1956 say anything to anyone here? Okay, good. It was both the Soviet invasion of Hungary. Oh, Giesel in the nose. And but also the Anglo-French invasion or attempt to recapture the Suez Canal from newly independent Egypt. So for him, these were twin events that showed both the continued sort of system of imperialism, but also the failings or sort of the unmasking of communism as an equally oppressive, or maybe not equally, but as an oppressive regime. So sort of the moral failure of communism in its sort of brutal oppression of Hungarian attempts to be freer. So those two events in 1956 caused sort of crisis of the left. So, okay, communism, the way it's being practiced in the Soviet Union, is not the way to go. Imperialism is still alive even after decolonization, at least in certain parts of the world. How are we going to position ourselves? And this was not only a political project, but also very much an intellectual project. So with heated debates in these journals, but also with various types of almost salon-style events throughout the country. So I like this picture. They go around the country in a bus. They have these new left clubs, and they actively debate various topics. Let's see. Going back. So he lived in London for a couple of years. He taught, so he'd been in literature. He was in this sort of broader, sort of political, philosophical journal context. But he started teaching in London, both at a secondary school, but also at arts colleges. And there he started moving into a more closer engagement with what he initially called the popular arts. From film, but also television, looking at mass media in general, advertising. And only eventually, when he moved to Birmingham, became more, or actually maybe only when he moved to Open University, became identified as a sociologist, someone who really moved across and transgressed these disciplinary boundaries. I thought it was also important to mention he'd been married for 50 years to Catherine, originally Barnett, but now Hall, who's an important historian, feminist historian, and also Jamaicanist historian in her own right. But I think their work has also sort of influenced each other. So in the 1960s, so he wasn't actually in London that long, moved to Birmingham, became first a fellow and then the director of the Center for Contemporary Cultural Studies, which was the first Center of Cultural Studies to exist, and where his previous work has been very much class-focused. It's more traditional left-wing Marxist tradition. In Birmingham, the focus was first increasingly on race, also on youth, more broad, so from class to look at class and youth, to look at class, youth, and race, and eventually also under pressure from the women's studies group within the CCCS, increasingly also looking at gender and using an intersectional lens to look at these things. This is a picture. I was just looking for pictures, Googling Stuart Hall, Birmingham, but I found this image, which was this was at a 1970 conference in Oxford, actually. The subtitle was Stuart Hall Manning the Creche, but there was a women's studies conference where the men had demonstratively said, okay, we will take care of the children while the women have their conference, which was, of course, meant as a political gesture, but the fact that they had to make that gesture was itself maybe also very telling. And someone wrote, someone on the internet wrote, in relation to this picture, this is the only picture where I've seen Stuart Hall looking uncomfortable. But I don't think that's necessarily true. I think he had an extremely loving relationship with his children. So it might be the reader's interpretation as well, which relates very much to the article or the work that Brian referred to, the encoding and decoding of media messages. But it's also a place where he struggled with, Birmingham, institutional politics. So to get a center like this off the ground, which transgressed established boundaries, so the sociologists didn't like people saying they were doing something like sociology or going out and interviewing people, going out and doing ethnography sometimes. But also drawing on literary criticism and philosophy. That annoyed them, but the English literature people also didn't like it. So there were various sort of disciplinary toes the center stepped on. They were also increasingly engaged in all kinds of political and theoretical interventions, so engaging very much with the politics of the time. So the university didn't like that very much. So there was a constant struggle to, on the one hand, sort of stay alive in this institutional landscape, but also to remain sort of critical within and to accommodate the different sort of political tendencies within various people associated with the center. Eventually he left, went to the Open University, which was in a way a less traditional academic environment. So while I was a professor of sociology, and to some extent, the Open University, you don't have regular teaching. You have students, but they're all grad students. But the Open University, somewhat like in the Netherlands, but here it has much less prominence. It had sort of open access, I guess now we would call it MOOCs, except they weren't online, but on television. So courses meant to educate anyone who was interested within the UK. So here he spent the rest of his academic career at the Open University until his retirement, and became, or he already was, but maintained his position as a very public figure in the media, but also in general political debates. Okay. So this was a general sense of his background. So you can see some of these themes already, his own personal background and its relation to his approaches to culture, but also his own politics and how that informed his own thinking, but also his positioning of himself within academia. So, as I said, there's many different themes that are possible to talk about. Oh, actually, I wanted to skip back and ask you a question. But one that's been interesting for me, because some of my work is directly on popular culture, is looking at what I've called the politics of popular culture. But one thing many people struggle with or trip over is what counts as popular culture and what doesn't. So if you allow me to throw one more question at you, what do you see as popular culture? Or if you had to say what popular culture is, how would you define it? If you already know the Stuart Hallian sort of context, don't answer. But sir, a non-dominant? Any dominant one? Dominant culture is popular. Okay, so sort of the culture of the majority, maybe the dominant.
Maybe
the most influential.
Sometimes not the majority, but
okay.
It's powerful people that
okay.
determine or influence what.
Okay, popular culture is the most dominant, influential form. Mm-hmm. Any other?
Maybe some kind of mostly widespread cultural practices which people involved and which they enjoy, and that's what makes them popular.
So sort of mass, or
yeah, but also the engagement.
So something you do for fun, yeah, as opposed to uplifting, a fun type of, yeah.
Isn't it something? I'm not really sure what I want to say antonym, but it's something like institutionalized cultures, or something to do with bottom up rather than top down. So as soon as it's in like the MoMA, it's not popular culture anymore.
Yeah, so a more, let's say, subaltern or grassroots compared to more institutionalized, established, yeah. Which often goes, as soon as it's in the MoMA, it stops being fun and it starts being sort of uplifting, is maybe the idea. Yeah. Any other thoughts? And all these things have been, or are still sometimes proffered as ideas of what popular culture is or can be. So, yeah?
Read the journal Popular Culture. It's actually often mediatized, often commercialized entertainment. So to speak. At least in that journal, it's often that.
So the role of the culture industry, which relates also to a bit to your idea of fun. It's entertainment, but it's also entertainment that's meant to sell. So there's actually a capitalist interest in getting you to watch this movie or to buy this comic book and so on. Yeah. So none of these ideas are at all wrong. And he goes through, this is one of the pieces also I want to discuss in the PhD workshop. But one of the questions he, in a relatively early piece, sets out to think through. So what is this popular in popular culture? And when we talk about popular, which literally is of the people, who is that? Who does popular culture refer to? Who does it belong to? So sometimes it's the majority, so the masses, the people. Sometimes it's the underclass, the people as the struggling, the working class. Sometimes popular culture is the folks, or traditional working class, maybe rural culture. That didn't really come up here, but that's maybe a more old school way of thinking about it. And often the contrast is with high culture. So indeed, this more institutionalized, museumified, canonized type of culture. So that's one sort of set of debates, like whose culture is it when we talk about popular culture? But another set of debates when people talk about popular culture is also, what does it do politically, or is it good or is it bad? So part of that is about uplift versus pleasure. Like, if it's pleasure, it's superficial. It should be uplifting. But another set of debates refers to, I think, what Wouter is also getting at, This idea that popular culture is very tied up with the culture industries and is therefore also completely part of capitalism, and that it's a way, or almost sort of opium for the masses. It's a way to incorporate people into the capitalist system, to stop them from rebelling, sort of a more Adorno way of thinking about culture industries, that it's actually a way of blinding people to the realities they are in. That's one way of looking at that sort of the popular culture as bad. But other people would say, no, popular culture is actually a form of resistance. It's again related to the subaltern classes. So this is where you see people rebelling and actually critiquing the system they're in, whether it's capitalism or imperialism or sexism. So it's actually good. It's people rebelling. Well, he says it's actually all and none of the above. What we should understand popular culture as is not by looking for this type of bounded definitions and saying it belongs to these people or it has this moral sort of outcome or this one. It's actually all of those things at the same time. What makes something popular culture is when you can understand it as a site, an everyday site, an incredibly important site for the negotiation precisely of those power relations, of capitalism, of sexism, of imperialism, of racism. So it is that site in the everyday, in the media, but also the way that people relate to and through that media, a site for struggle. So it's never settled. It's precisely where these struggles over, in a Gramscian term, cultural hegemony take place. And that's when you know it's popular culture, when it is a site of struggle. So it's all those things and more. And hegemony, which, do you know what hegemony is? Okay, you all. So what is it? Okay. Hegemony is Gramsci is an Italian, I guess, could we call him political philosopher? Oh, yes.
Like political or economic superior
Kind of.
control over others.
Mm-hmm. It is about control, but it's actually looking at how a system of control, is mainly looking in this case at capitalism, a form of political economy, how it is enforced, how social order is enforced, not through actually coercion, not through violence, but through consent. So that actually people come to believe that the system they're in, the social order they're in, is normal, is natural, and is good for everyone involved. And that if you're not happy or if you're suffering, then it's not the system's fault, but it's probably you. So this type of, and that's where power over meaning and power over culture comes into play. So it's much easier to rule over people when they believe that the system is good and right, than to have to rule over them through guns and force. So that's the general idea of hegemony.
False consciousness, right?
Sorry?
It's more of a false consciousness for the people that believe in that, and that hegemony is
Yeah, but false consciousness is a more sort of, let's say, old school Marxist term. And hegemony is slightly more subtle. But I mean, they relate to each other. But it's you can see it in many different ways. Or one way of thinking about it in the context of the U.S., for instance, is the American dream. People say, okay, America is a place where anyone can get ahead, and even though we all know more or less that this is not true, it is a very, very strong imaginary. Also, the idea that the U.S. doesn't have class, and if you, just like New York, if you can make it there, you can make it everywhere. Just struggle hard enough, and you can make it. But that means that if you can't make it, or if you don't make it, but you still believe in this American dream, you end up blaming yourself. Like, well, I guess I didn't work hard enough, or I guess I wasn't good enough, as opposed to, the system is exploitative. And, for instance, if I'm non-white, or if I'm a woman, or if I am from a working class background, because those do exist, I actually already have a big sort of gap that is very hard to catch up with. Yeah, so this is sort of a general introduction to how he takes the general idea of hegemony and applies it to popular culture in a range of contexts in primarily or initially UK popular culture. So it's also moved to look at the formative role of popular culture. So not just a reflective role, it wasn't that popular culture reflects what is going on, but it actually is formative or maybe even generative in processes of social and political change. So if we want to understand where is society going, where are power relations going, popular culture is an excellent place to start looking. Another text I want to discuss in the workshop, which is in a way a follow-up to this first seminal article, though it has a sort of different slant to it, is focusing on Black popular culture. So he started sort of his interest sort of shifted over the years, and one of his focuses was looking at Black popular culture. But here asked a related question, so rather than asking what is a popular, not that he thought that was settled, he said, okay, that's still up for interrogation, but here I wanted to ask, okay, what is Black when we talk about Black popular culture? It was also in a somewhat ambivalent relation to sort of discourses of Blackness in the United States, as you would find with certain other UK-based scholars, such as Paul Gilroy, said there's a certain tendency towards essentialism, which was sort of, in direct tension with his approach to culture and identity in general. So he said there's no necessary unity or essential Blackness, or he spoke of the end of the I can't remember the exact phrase, but the innocent idea of the essential Black subject. So the idea that there is one sort of unified Black subject is problematic in its own right. He said in a way it's sort of a reversal of the idea of biological racism, the idea that there's one Black subject. So you can see certain things in Black popular culture that mark it as Black, but we should understand those as being part of the Black diasporic aesthetic. And dimensions that he identified in this article is one, style. That style is not necessarily the coating or the form, but style is actually the central subject of this type of popular culture. Also music as a sort of rebuke to what he calls logocentric, sort of word-focused ideas of what culture should be, showing how music and sound is actually a central form of this aesthetic, or a central sort of modus. But also the role of the body. So especially for people who, over the centuries, had very limited types of capital, he says, I find this a beautiful phrase, we've worked on ourselves as the canvases of representation. So when given limited access to other forms of representation, people work on themselves as also, again, a political focus. But the main point he was making here, by again challenging this essentialist focus, is that when you talk about Black popular culture, it's also precisely in this popular culture that Blackness is being negotiated and contested. And again, you see here struggles over meaning, over what is to be the dominant meaning of Blackness. Or at least that's one of the ways you could look at it. So again, popular culture is not about affirming that this is what culture is or this is what Blackness is, but it's a site where those terms, where those meanings are being negotiated and contested. And one of the ways through which he contested this essentialist position on racial identity was, and I guess here is where the insights from his Birmingham experience came out, is that it's always an intersectional experience. So you cannot say this is Blackness, or for that matter, this is whiteness, or this is Indianness, because it's always mediated through different types of positionality, through gender, through sexuality, through your class position, so through these different positionalities, and again, these relations, that is where meaning and identity take shape. It's always contingent. Okay. I wanted in general to, maybe I should speed up a little. I wanted in general to think through not just the general and historic importance of these maybe I can flip back for 1 second. Importance of these topics, which to some extent have been quite UK focused, but also to think of what can we take from them as people living in the Netherlands now, or how does these relate to Dutch negotiations, Dutch forms of hegemony. So it's maybe slightly more evident in the next example I had, but also a little bit, I think, in this context. So when we think about these things, do you have any ideas, like how is this relevant to our understanding of the Netherlands or Dutch popular culture? Yeah.
Actually, I had a question related to this about political blackness. Something we have in the Netherlands, something like non-whiteism, like everything that's not white is black. I was wondering what was his thoughts about this, because he doesn't have an essential definition of blackness. Would he be in favor of this political blackness that we observe in the Netherlands? At least that's from my perspective.
Oh, it's hard to say. I mean, I noticed this with previous speakers. What would Hannah Arendt say about this? And it's hard to, I find it hard to speak for him, but definitely he identified as black. Even though also coming from Jamaica, he was grown up in the distinction of brownness versus blackness, and a different type of black, let's say, ontology of blackness than in the U.S. But he was very much committed to struggles against colonialism and racism both in Jamaica and in the UK. And also in the UK, in a previous time, black was also taken to mean Indian, Pakistani, everything that wasn't white. So, yeah, hard to say in a very direct way what he would have think. But I think there is a connection to be made. Say, okay, what the meaning of blackness is in the Netherlands today is also very much being negotiated and contested, with some people saying, look to the US, that's where we can take inspiration of how to formulate a political blackness. Other people saying, no, we could do it differently. Some people say we need to shape solidarity and form a type of political blackness that doesn't look necessarily at being able to trace your descendants back to the African continent, whereas other people. So perhaps it's exactly in this moment that we see a related struggle over the meaning of the term black, the concept of black. I think we see this a lot in the media and social media, but maybe more explicitly. And one of the things I'm interested also in is how can we see it slightly less explicitly, or maybe still bluntly, but not necessarily articulated as politics, but articulated as culture. But I'm sure we can see these things similarly.
When you said culture is political, how would you now want to see blackness, not as politics, but as culture, after you told us that?
No, in culture, yeah, absolutely. That's a good point. But I mean, articulated explicitly as but people saying, I'm now doing politics, I'm an activist, or, I'm making a statement that I see as part of the struggle, as opposed to people themselves saying, like, okay, here's some entertainment. One related example perhaps, Wouter, who's here, van Gent and I, we wrote an article analyzing the movie Alleen maar nette mensen. It's a Dutch movie, which is a pretty terrible movie, where we also try to show how the imaginaries of this that you see in this movie, which itself was critiqued when it came out, but also how they map onto, again, the material, the political, economic, but also the spatial, the demographic sort of shifts that we see happening in Amsterdam. So how can we connect these imaginaries of who belongs where, of who's supposed to be poor, who is dangerous, how they should be relegated to the outskirts of Amsterdam? How can we understand those imaginations of the city of Amsterdam in relation to what's actually happening on the ground in terms of housing shortages, gentrification, a specific type of economic policy that the municipality is generating. So this, I don't think we necessarily thought this when we were writing the article, but I think it was a very Stuart Hallian gesture to not just say, let's analyze the popular culture, which is something I was trying to do, but seeing it as sort of separate from, let's say, more concrete social science practice, but to actually say you must always look at this media message in relation to these material conditions, these material problems of housing, of inequality, of economics, of economic policy, of tourism policy. You can't see them as separate from each other. So you can't understand this film only by looking at the film, or you can try. But you should understand it in relation to what's actually happening on the ground in the city around us. And there it helps to have geographers who have the numbers, who can do the maps. That's one way we try to unwittingly develop a Stuart Hallian approach to urban studies. Okay, well, another topic which I think the relevance to contemporary Dutch society is also not so hard to guess, is in a, I don't know if it was a prescient book, it's probably more that the topic is just very hard to get rid of. But a book that came out from the Birmingham Center for Cultural Studies, Policing the Crisis, came out in 1978. It was a response to so-called mugging crisis. That's a sort of a moral panic that hit the British nation in the early 1970s. This book was seen specifically also as a public intervention following the Handsworth mugging incident in the early 1970s. 3 youths consistently described of mixed ethnic descent. They mugged or robbed and beat up an elderly, I think, Irish gentleman in Handsworth, and were sentenced. So they stole 30 pence, I think. But together they were sentenced to 40 years in prison. So this was seen as an extremely harsh sentence. And sort of the outrage that followed, both the outrage over the mugging, but also over these harsh sentences, because these were teenagers, they decided to analyze what is going on here, and also to look at how the media came to construct the drama, the idea of a rapid increase in mugging, which, as they pointed out, actually wasn't any type of statistical category. So you couldn't even trace whether mugging had increased or decreased. But what you could see is that violent crime rates had actually decreased. So there actually was no real crisis in terms of street violence. But they wanted to understand, why is the British media, but also the British public more generally, why are they so obsessed about mugging? Why this call for these very harsh sentences, or also this widespread support for this type of crackdown on specifically young black Brits? How can we understand this in broader terms? And they used here the term of both moral panic and the associated term of folk devil, which were developed by Stanley Cohen. To understand what was going on. So looking at mugging as a label, and one that was also imported from the US. So mugging wasn't actually a British term. It was something that people looked to the US and said, oh, we actually also have mugging going on here. So the folk devil, sort of the group that you project everything on as the problem and the source of all evil, becomes these black muggers. Or it's actually such a racialized term that you can just say mugger and everyone knows that you actually mean black mugger. And I think, again, this is a very US-based term. So Stanley Cohen was the first to sort of talk about these things, and in a related context, or actually the CCCS was also looking at other moral panics related to white youth subcultures, and Stanley Cohen was doing this as well. He's looking at mods and rockers. I don't know if we have so many youth subcultures now that people get very stressed out about, but this is 60s and 70s, people completely flipping out about hippies and later on punks and so on. They were asking not just, as Stanley Cohen did, like what's going on in terms of constructing the label here, like who's getting singled out and who's getting labeled and how does that labeling take place. So they also traced that. But again, they wanted to understand how can we root this in real material conditions and problems? How can we see this not just as sort of a figment of the imagination or construct, but what actual political, economic sort of conditions and structures do these moral panics relate to? And the way they analyzed it was to say what's actually going on here is a post-war, or specifically post-1968, crisis in hegemony, or crisis in the social order. So the consensus that was there in sort of post-Second World War UK, the rolling out of the welfare state, sort of consensus agreement that you never had it so good, everyone's becoming affluent, everyone will soon be middle class, even though that wasn't true. Most people believe that. But at a certain point it started eroding in sort of multiple ways. The basis of that hegemony started eroding. The economic basis started showing through, so the economy started doing worse in the 1970s. But also in 1968, or the other things that happened in the 60s, but Summer of Love, hippies, Paris, all these different things sort of shook the sort of traditional family authority, the idea that father knows best, and the queen is there for you. All these sort of traditional bases of authority, they started eroding as well. So basically, it says what you see is a shift away from consent. This hegemonic structure is no longer really holding up very well. And it also means a shift towards coercion. So again, when you can't get people to all agree on that the system is best for you, that we're all in it together, then coercion is the way to go. And here he sees sort of the start of a popular authoritarianism, also associated with Thatcher, come out around mugging. So he says mugging, or this obsession with mugging, is a response to, or it's a way of deflecting or displacing these anxieties, which are really about something much bigger, about where are we going, where is this society going, where is the economy going, and sort of this racialized framing of the problem is an easy political way of deflecting and displacing those more deeply rooted and more difficult to speak anxieties. So this is not a very difficult question, but how can we see these things going on in the Netherlands today? Who might our folk devils be? Mm-hmm. 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 And what hegemonic dissensus do you think underlies that? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Or just in some sense things are changing and people just change and they're practically.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Any other refinements? Oh, okay. You don't want to discuss with me? Okay. I mean, I think you hit the nail on the head. I think beyond just Islamophobia, I think in terms of the figure of the black bugger, probably the Moroccan Dutch hangjongeren, or some people like to use the word street terrorist, is sort of the equivalent currently of the black bugger. Also in the context of what is real, what is not real. So where they trace the actually decreasing rates of street crime. Similarly here, all the time we see actual figures show that crime, violent crime, almost every rate of crime you can find is going down. Yet there is this panic about, endangerment and scary, threatening, indeed, predominantly Muslim youth or Moroccan youth. It's not just crime, but terrorism is in the mix there as well. But the actual threat or the actual level of safety that people in Dutch cities have is we're actually very, very safe. So you have to ask what is actually going on. Yeah.
Don't forget to challenging authority, police authority outright, which is
The traitor vlogger?
you miss that?
Oh, I think I missed it. Oh, well, you can tell I don't watch TV enough. Is that filming back or?
Yeah, it's one of the.
That's the whole thing.
Oops.
They are inviting youth from Poelenburg to explain their considerations of blogging about their lives.
So the vlog becomes the new site of contestation and negotiation. So I do think there are many sort of resonances we could see between 1970s Britain and 2010s the Netherlands. Though at the same time, I think we have a different historical genealogy of thinking about difference, of thinking about cities, of speaking race, and so on. So I don't think you can completely map it one-on-one, but at the same time, I think there's a lot to learn here as well in terms of not taking at face value that the anxieties are about the specific anxieties, though they also are, but taking seriously also the economic, the material conditions, the anxieties that are harder to see when you only look at the focus, the primary focus. This work relates more broadly also to other, and again, it's a massive body of work. Thoughts on racism, and one point he made, which again I think resonates very much to recent discussions in the Netherlands, is to say, on the one hand, the way racism works or worked in the UK in the 1970s, but also later on, is to see as race or to see racism or race as a problem coming from outside. So, we didn't have problems until these people came, until these outsiders came. But what he emphasizes is race or race relations. It's never something external. It's something created by colonialism. It's something created within the British Empire. So how can you say this is external when it's always been internal? But apparently in the early 1500s, Queen, I think it was Elizabeth I, was already worrying about there being too many black people and there was going to be a famine and would there be enough food for her own people. So this is not something that happened in the mid-20th century. This sort of dynamics are there from early colonialism. So that we should reframe the debate to think about the insider status, the internality of these relations, as opposed to seeing it as something new and outside. And I think this is something we also we see in the Netherlands in multiple ways. One, by keeping the conversation on migration as if it's something new, something that just happened, and they came and then we had it. We never had others before. Which I think also sort of conveniently forgets about the Second World War and sort of like, we were really homogenous before we were really homogenous before migration. I think like, so what was the Holocaust about then? Anyway, it's a digression. But more generally, I think this relates also to work by Gloria Wekker. This idea that racism also works through historical amnesia, through a denial or a willful forgetting of the colonial past. So this is one point that Hall and colleagues made, but at the same time he said, while we should always keep in mind this colonial context, these colonial histories, at the same time we should understand specific sort of conjunctures, is the word he would use, of racism as specific, as culturally specific and historically specific. So racism is not universal. It's not the same everywhere and at all times. We have to understand it within the specific material, historical, cultural relations of what he would call a specific societal conjuncture. So what the group were talking about, and in the context of mugging, was in the societal conjuncture of Powellism, related to Enoch Powell, who was a very explicit racist, we could say, and then how within Thatcherism, with its sort of neoliberal, early neoliberal, sort of free market, but also its popular authoritarianism, how they reworked these sort of explicit racialized ideas into a slightly more subtle or less explicit mix. So I think there perhaps we could see somewhat similar dynamics in the Dutch situation. Maybe we could draw an analogy with Paulism, Thatcherism. Maybe there's something like Wilderism, Rutteism, though I don't know that Rutte has as sort of coherent a project as Margaret Thatcher. But who knows? Okay, and a final point here, and this goes back again a bit to the idea of there being no essential ontology of blackness. Race is always a floating signifier. It's not something you can pin down, and that slipperiness is also part of the difficulty of racism. That it's always its meaning is always relational. It's never fixed. It's a signifier. It's not just textual. It's also something that's read off of bodies. So bodies become signifiers. But it's very slippery. So even though at a certain point, the biological basis has been completely abandoned, rejected by science, then people start rooting it in culture or religion. So I think you see this in the Netherlands, where at a certain point race was discredited and removed also from government language. So race, unlike in the UK or the US, it's not a government census category anywhere. But then it sort of goes underground and becomes speakable through religion or culture. So in that sense, it sort of floats around and sticks itself to other categories. Okay, moving on. So I guess I'm not short, but not shorter because of my cough. This is my last slide. So again, these were just sort of two themes out of many other ones I could have taken, and I've touched on sort of related themes: cultural hybridity, sort of anti-essentialism that were also central to Hall's work. But I wanted to end on by reflecting on his position on intellectual work, and he made here a critical distinction between academic work, sort of the work we do in the academy, educating people, granting degrees, publishing, getting grants. So I don't think that was as important. It was part of the work in the 1970s, versus intellectual work, which is the work of thought, of theorizing, but also of action, of practice. And for him, also, intellectual work should always have a purpose. So it should never just be about theory with a capital C. It shouldn't be theory for the sake of theory. It should always have a purpose. Intellectual work, I like this quote, it should be a practice that always, or it is a practice which always thinks about its intervention in a world in which it would make some difference, in which it would have some effect. So we shouldn't see intellectual work or intellectual activities as frivolous or a luxury. It's actually a work of what he calls deadly seriousness. So, of course, this makes us feel important, but I do truly believe this. I think this is why many of us joined the academy, not just to be able to have the luxury and the privilege of being able to think and read books and talk to each other. This is definitely a great privilege to have, but also because we believe that there is something to be added to the world by doing this theorizing. This, he says, is a contrast with academic work. Academic work is just keeping the mill running to some extent, but intellectual work is work that makes a difference. And I think this is also different from the valorisatie or impact that is sometimes a similar framing of societal relevance that we see now in Dutch or non-Dutch universities. So question is, how can we have an impact, but not necessarily the impact that is recognized by not even funding agencies, but let's say government agencies, because the point of theory might be precisely to critique the government rather than translate its political aims into more effective policy. So one of the critiques actually that's been leveled at the Birmingham Center or Hall and colleagues is that they were much better at critiquing and analyzing than coming up with sort of, effective schemes of policy and improvement. But I don't think it's necessarily either or. I think sometimes critique and analysis is precisely the intervention. So to have a explicit analysis, a very detailed and theoretical, both empirically detailed and theoretically profound analysis of something that's going on, and that includes government interventions and police. To be able to critique that rigorously is perhaps as important as proposing a better policy for police reform. I don't think they're mutually exclusive, but I think intervention is not necessarily only shown by a policy recommendation. Let me maybe just skip over the next 2 points, but this relates also to certain Gramscian ideas of organic intellectuals that are not necessarily embedded in institutions, but sort of grow from and amongst the people. And in Birmingham, he also spoke of the risks of institutionalization of cultural studies, but of any basically type of intellectual work. He said this also later on, referring to the institutionalization of cultural studies in the U.S., where there's a different type of, sort of funding for academia. That basically there's this fabulous sort of theoretical apparatus, and all these people are really good at critiquing and understanding where power lies and how you can decode it and so on. But is it actually engaging with anything outside of the academy, or is precisely its institutionalization within the academy part of what makes it less forceful outside of the academy? So I think these are questions we can also ask ourselves. Another thing that I really appreciate about his stance on intellectual work or labor is that it's not an individual effort. I think this is something that's slowly coming to be recognized or re-recognized in our context, maybe also a little bit in relation to Rethink and other parts of the movement we had here at the UvA in recent years. But the fact that it's not something we do alone. So many of his works were, like this one, a collaborative authorship. So really recognizing that, these are things we do together, and no form of intellectual output is sort of springs from the mind of an individual without intensive dialogue and sort of feedback and back and forth. Another sort of related point he made is that intellectual work is never done. It's never closed. So he also, in his own sort of lifetime, sometimes people, or another critique is that, he wasn't a fully consistent thinker. But it was actually a position to say that you can change your mind. You don't have to agree with yourself when you were 25, when you're 65. It's actually healthy to circle back and look at your own work and change your mind, or to modify it, or to change it. So I think this understanding of intellectual work as a process, and one that's open-ended, is also not necessarily conducive to certain sort of output, excellence-oriented criteria, but is also healthy to say that, you can write something, but you can also revisit it, and it doesn't have to be the last word or the best word ever. It's a process. And a final, this is again a Gramscian, so I think Gramsci was one of his great thinker heroes, but he was in general somewhat pessimistic about the state of society, though I think as a personality he seems to be very sort of charismatic and friendly and supportive of everyone around him. But how can you study misery and inequality and suffering and brutality and still sort of find the will to go on? There he refers then to Gramsci's idea of pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will. So even if intellectually you could see everything that's going wrong, the inequity of all these structures of power, of knowledge, of material relations, you still have a responsibility, an ethical duty, basically, to remain willfully optimistic, even in the face of what you study every day. So that's something I try to enact in my own research as well. So, and I hope you will too. So, thank you.